Have you ever thought about the true cost of silence? Not the kind that brings peace, but the silence that conceals deep wounds, veils painful truths, and slowly tears apart families. Today, I'm about to share a story that goes far beyond what's written in sacred texts. A tale of betrayal, lost innocence, and devastating silence. It's a story of how even the man after God's own heart, the mighty King David, failed in the most crucial role of all, fatherhood. Imagine this. A young, virtuous princess walks through the corridors of the royal palace. Her footsteps echo softly, her heart filled with nothing but kindness and innocence. She's on her way to visit her half-brother, unaware that in a moment her life will be shattered forever. What awaits her in that room isn't just betrayal. It's a nightmare that no one could have predicted. But here's the shocking part. The one person who should have stood by her, the one who should have protected her, remained eerily silent. The silence was deafening, and it speaks volumes about the price of ignoring the truth. What happened next will leave you speechless, and it's a story you won't forget. Are you ready to dive deeper into this unimaginable betrayal? The price of silence, the unspoken pain. Let's walk through this heart-wrenching journey together. Comment 777 if you're prepared to discover how one moment of silence led to a life-altering tragedy in the royal palace. The story is far from over. Stay with me and let's unravel the truth. The shocking story of David's only daughter in 2 Samuel. To truly grasp the gravity of what happened to David's only daughter, we must journey back, far beyond the walls of modern memory, into the heart of ancient Jerusalem, nearly 1,000 years before Christ walked the earth. Picture it. The city gleaming under the sun, its highest point crowned with a palace of stone and splendor. Inside that fortress of royal power lived a man revered as the greatest king Israel had ever known, David. The giant slayer of Goliath, the warrior poet, the shepherd boy anointed by God himself. His psalms still echo across centuries, comforting broken souls and stirring spirits into praise. But the tale you're about to hear is not about his victories in battle or his poetic brilliance. No. This is the unraveling of something far more fragile and sacred, his role as a father. It is not about the throne David sat on, but about the silence that reigned in his household. And it all begins with a young woman named Tamar, his only daughter. David's kingdom was a spectacle of success. Under his rule, borders were expanded, enemies subdued, and prosperity reigned like never before. His name became synonymous with justice, wisdom, and divine favor. But behind the grandeur of the kingdom lay the quieter chambers of the royal household, where power and passion, rivalry and resentment brewed beneath the surface. Within those palace walls was a family divided, not just by bloodlines, but by the consequences of unchecked emotions and unequal affections. David, like many kings of his era, had multiple wives and concubines. From them came a multitude of sons and daughters, each growing up under the same roof, yet living in different emotional worlds. Amnon, his firstborn, held the position of heir to the throne. Absalom, another of David's sons, was widely admired for his striking appearance and charm. And then there was Tamar, Absalom's full sister, a graceful, innocent young princess. Her story, however, was not destined to be one of joy or honor. It would be one marked by betrayal and unspeakable pain. Have you ever considered how a man celebrated for his sensitivity to God's voice could become deaf to the cries within his own home? How does a father who poured out his soul in songs of lament and praise fail to speak when his daughter needed him most? "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted," David once wrote in Psalm 34:18. But when that broken heart belonged to his own daughter, where was that closeness? This isn't just an ancient tragedy, it's a mirror. a reflection of how the very same blindness that infected David's household continues to destroy families today. What we're about to unfold is not merely a historical account. It's a timeless warning about the dangers of neglect, favoritism, and the failure to confront evil within. If you were standing in David's palace as a servant, or perhaps if you were Tamar herself, what would you have seen? What signs would you have noticed in the days before everything fell apart? Could anything have been done to stop what was coming? As we trace the events leading to Tamar's devastation, three piercing truths will emerge. Lessons every parent must absorb, every leader must reflect on, and every believer must take to heart. These are signs that, if ignored, can turn a home into a battlefield. Because make no mistake, what happened to Tamar wasn't just the result of one man's wicked impulse. It was the result of many small silences, many subtle signs overlooked, and a family structure left unguarded. So stay with me, don't turn away, because this is more than a story about a princess and a palace. It is about the kind of betrayal that wounds without drawing blood, and about a silence that screams louder than any sword ever could. And perhaps, just perhaps, it is also about what you can do, starting today, to ensure that silence never rules in your home. Long before the storm of sorrow erupted in the royal palace, the seeds of chaos had already been quietly planted. According to 2 Samuel chapter 3, David's ascent to the throne was not only a story of battlefield glory or political triumph, it was also the tale of a family growing in complexity and tension. While reigning in Hebron, David fathered 6 sons from 6 different women: Amnon by Ahinoam, Chileab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal, Absalom by Maacah, Adonijah by Haggith, Shephatiah by Abital, and Ithream by Eglah. And that was only the beginning. Later, when David moved to Jerusalem, his household expanded even further. With each new wife and concubine came new sons, new loyalties, and new fractures. Can you picture it? The grand halls of Jerusalem's palace, stone corridors echoing with the laughter, arguments, and footsteps of young princes, raised side by side, yet separated by lineage and maternal ambition. Each boy not only bore the heavy crown of royal blood, but also carried the whispered dreams of the woman who bore him. What was it like for Tamar to grow up in this kingdom of thrones and tensions? Act 2. Samuel 13:1 gives us our first glimpse into the heart of the tragedy to come. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and after a time Amnon, David's son, loved her. One verse. That's all it took for the Bible to hint at the devastating chain of events about to unfold. Amnon, David's firstborn and heir apparent, found himself captivated not by a foreign beauty or a stranger, but by his own half-sister. Have you ever wondered, what twisted paths does love take when it is not governed by righteousness but by obsession? To the outside world, life in David's palace appeared harmonious. He was a king who had it all: military dominance, widespread respect, and a kingdom stretching from Dan to Beersheba, 2 Samuel 3:10. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. The danger wasn't an enemy army at the gates. It was what was festering inside the family fortress: jealousy, rivalry, isolation. The warning signs were there, subtle but visible to the discerning eye. But who was truly watching? The very structure of the household was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The sons of David, born from different mothers, were not only royal siblings, they were political threats to one another's future. Amnon, the eldest, held a position of unique privilege. He had access to the inner rooms of the palace, influence over key decisions, and the quiet, expectant approval of a father too distracted to notice the shift in tone. Absalom, on the other hand, had already begun to show the qualities that would one day shape him into a charismatic challenger to David's throne. He was handsome, strategic, and fiercely protective of his full sister. Tamar. In the background of this volatile mix stood Tamar, the royal virgin, shielded by palace custom but completely unaware of the darkness forming around her. And then there was Jonadab. Remember his name. As mentioned in 2 Samuel 13:3, Jonadab was the son of David's brother Shimea, a cousin to the princes and a so-called friend to Amnon. But the scripture adds one chilling detail. He was a very crafty man. It would be Jonadab's whispered advice that would provide Amnon with the idea that would shatter Tamar's life forever. How often does evil enter not with a sword, but with a whisper from someone close? Jonadab's presence at court and his ability to manipulate Amnon so easily exposes a deeper truth. Families don't fall apart overnight. They erode slowly, as poor counsel is allowed too close, as jealousy is left unchallenged, and as boundaries meant to protect are treated as optional. Doesn't Proverbs 13:20 warn us? Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. What happens when a prince chooses a serpent for a friend? The more we look, the clearer it becomes. The real danger wasn't just Amnon's desire, it was the architecture of the family itself, disjointed, rivalrous, and vulnerable. Each child had their own group of supporters, their own loyalties, and their own vision for the future. And in the midst of this, David, the man anointed by God, the same man who wrote in Psalm 23, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me," was absent where it mattered most. He had the wisdom to rule a nation, but failed to see the storm brewing in his own home. Deuteronomy 6:6-7 commands, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road." But how can a father fulfill this commandment if he is rarely present in the hallways of his own house? Have you ever felt the consequences of a leader who can't see what's happening under his own roof? The scriptures do not embellish the signs. They were real and they were there. Tamar was left unguarded, protected only by custom, not by active concern. Amnon was emboldened by entitlement, and Jonadab was the match that lit the fuse. This isn't just a story from thousands of years ago. It's a reflection, a warning. What happens when ambition is greater than integrity? What happens when a father's silence becomes more damaging than a stranger's cruelty? And what might have changed if anyone had spoken up before the line was crossed? The curtain has not yet fully lifted on the tragedy, but the stage is now set. A look, a lust, a lie, and a kingdom poised on the edge of fracture. And then, just when you think the family tensions couldn't get worse, the story takes a sickening plunge into darkness. What began as unspoken longing now festers into something far more dangerous. In 2 Samuel 13:2, the scriptures reveal a haunting detail. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar. But this was no innocent affection. It wasn't love, it was obsession, twisted, relentless, and burning a hole in Amnon's soul like a wildfire with no rain in sight. This wasn't merely temptation, it was a consuming sickness of the heart, the kind that blinds a man to morality, distorts his judgment, and poisons even his conscience. And here lies a tragic question for us to ponder. How many lives have been destroyed not by weapons, but by unchecked desires that festered in silence? Amnon, the king's firstborn, had grown up with everything handed to him: attention, privilege, access, and authority. He was used to the world bending toward his wants, but now the one thing he wanted was something God had forbidden. Tamar, his own half-sister, a young woman of beauty and grace, a daughter of David. His obsession wasn't only immoral, it was illegal, it was vile, and above all, it was predatory. And then comes Jonadab. Remember him? The one the Bible describes as very shrewd in 2 Samuel 13:3. A cousin, a so-called friend, a man who looked into the eyes of a tormented prince and chose not to call him to repentance, but to help him carry out his wickedness. "Why are you, the king's son, so haggard morning after morning?" he asked, a question laced with false concern. That question cracked open the door to one of the most devious traps ever recorded in Scripture. Can you feel the tension in that moment? One word of truth from Jonadab could have changed everything. One godly rebuke might have saved Tamar, spared Amnon, and preserved the fragile peace of David's house. But instead, Jonadab sharpened the dagger of deceit. "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," he whispered, "and when your father comes to see you, ask him to send your sister Tamar to cook and feed you." 2 Samuel 13:5. Simple, diabolical, effective. Jonadab didn't just create a scheme, he weaponized culture. He knew that in that time it was expected for women of the royal house to care for the sick. It was part of their role, their expression of familial duty. He took something pure and twisted it into a snare. Neither David nor Tamar would see it coming, and perhaps that's what makes the story so horrifying. Not just what happened, but how easily it happened. Have you ever trusted someone so much that it never occurred to you they could be planning your downfall? Tamar did, David did. That trust would cost them both dearly. Now the trap was in motion. Amnon, without flinching, carried out his role in the performance. 2 Samuel 13:6 recounts, "So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand.'" The lie was smooth. The words were calm. There was no sign of the sickness that truly plagued Amnon's heart. And David, unaware, agreed. A father who once fled from Saul, who had discerned the hearts of men in battle and strategy, now failed to see the serpent in his son's request. Have you ever considered how the most dangerous betrayals often hide in plain sight, dressed in the garments of innocence? This was more than a deception. It was a desecration of everything sacred: family trust, sibling bonds, royal protection. Tamar had no reason to suspect. She entered the room not as a victim, but as a loving sister. She walked in, believing she was bringing comfort, not realizing she was stepping into a carefully laid net of control. Amnon used everything at his disposal to ensure the trap would work: his status as the firstborn, his father's compassion, his sister's goodness. It was not only lust driving him, it was entitlement, power, the hunger not just to possess but to dominate. In that moment, Amnon wasn't just defiling a woman, he was corrupting the soul of the royal family. And what of David? He had no suspicion, but should he have? Proverbs 27:12 warns us clearly, "The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it." David, perhaps weary from ruling a nation, perhaps dulled by routine, perhaps too trusting of his own son, allowed his guard to fall. Have you ever missed a warning sign in someone you loved, only to realize later that silence cost you more than words ever could have? The story of Tamar, up to this point, is not just a record of sin. It is a lesson in the danger of ignoring inner decay. It's about how evil doesn't always kick down the door. Sometimes it gets invited in. One favor, one glance, one unchecked desire at a time. And so the stage is set. The trap is laid. Tamar enters the room with bread in her hands, and no idea that her innocence is about to be violated. Tamar walked down the palace halls, unaware that her life was about to be shattered beyond recognition. Her footsteps were not rushed. Her hands held the ingredients of comfort. Her heart, innocent and obedient, bore no suspicion. After all, it was her brother she was going to see, Amnon, the firstborn of the king. She was simply fulfilling her duty, doing what any devoted sister would do. In her purity, there was no room for fear. But isn't it often in moments of normalcy that the worst betrayals strike? Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that the thought of danger never crossed your mind? Tamar stepped into Amnon's chambers with no guard, no hesitation, no suspicion. She prepared food for him, kneading and baking the dough before his eyes. Her care was genuine, her service tender. Everything in the scene spoke of familial devotion, except for the one watching her with eyes that burned, not with fever, but with lust. As she approached to serve the food, the moment turned. The illusion crumbled. Amnon seized her. "Come to bed with me, my sister," he said. 2 Samuel 13:11. Can you imagine her heartbeat in that instant? The panic, the confusion, the realization that the sickness he claimed was a lie and that she had walked into a trap. Tamar's response is immediate, clear, and courageous.
"No, my brother!"
she pleads, her voice undoubtedly shaking yet strong with truth.
"Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing."
2 Samuel 13:12. She knew the law. She knew the moral code of God's people. She knew that what Amnon desired was more bitter than death itself. Like Ecclesiastes 7:26 declares, "I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, but the sinner she will ensnare." Yet here the roles twist. Tamar is no snare, but Amnon is the sinner, ensnared by his own evil desire, dragging her into the pit with him. Tamar tried everything. She appealed to reason, to decency, even to his sense of royal protocol. "Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." 2 Samuel 13:13. Was she truly suggesting that David would approve? Likely not. It was a desperate attempt, perhaps to buy time, to escape, or to awaken any shred of humanity in Amnon's soul. But his heart had already been handed over to darkness. The scripture records with chilling clarity, but he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. 2 Samuel 13:14. Pause. Let that sink in. This wasn't a stranger. This was her own brother. This wasn't outside the palace. It was in its very heart. The royal family, the house of David, became the setting for one of the Bible's most devastating betrayals. And then, just when you think it can't get worse, it does. Immediately after violating her, Amnon's desire curdles into disgust. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. 2 Samuel 13:15. Isn't that often the way with sin? What once appeared to be irresistible craving reveals its true face: shame, loathing, and destruction. Amnon's love had never been love. It had been entitlement, pride, and perversion. And now, having taken what was forbidden, he despised her for reminding him of his guilt. He didn't just hate her, he cast her out, as if she were the one who had defiled the family name. "Get up and get out," he shouted. Tamar begged him again, not to undo what he had already done, for that was impossible, but at least to spare her the added humiliation. "Sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me." 2 Samuel 13:16. But he wouldn't listen. He called his servant and had her thrown out like refuse. That moment was not just cruel, it was calculated, it was public. And Tamar, broken and disgraced, tore the ornate robe she wore, a garment worn by virgin daughters of the king, and poured ashes on her head. 2 Samuel 13:19. She didn't go into hiding. She didn't run to erase what had happened. She made her suffering visible. Her torn robe was her cry to the world. Her ashes were her scream. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. Can you hear her sobs? Can you feel the agony of a daughter of the king who had been treated worse than a slave? In that culture, tearing one's garments and covering oneself in ashes was the sign of ultimate mourning. Tamar wasn't just grieving what happened, She was grieving who she had been, her future, her reputation, her voice. And it is in this moment that we arrive at the part of the story that leaves readers speechless. It's not just Amnon's sin that breaks our hearts. It's what comes next, or rather, what doesn't. The silence. Where was David? Where was justice? Where was the father whose psalms filled the temple and whose victories built a nation? Where was his roar of righteous anger? The scriptures say in 2 Samuel 13:21 that David was furious. But there's no record of punishment, no rebuke, no consequence. Have you ever needed someone to defend you and they did nothing? This is the moment that gives this story its name, the silence of David. And that silence would echo for generations, shaking not only Tamar's life, but the entire kingdom of Israel. The palace walls could not contain the news for long. Whispers became shouts. Servants exchanged looks of horror. The shameful deed committed behind closed doors now echoed through the marble corridors of the kingdom. And finally, it reached the ears of the king. When King David heard all this, he was furious. 2 Samuel 13:21. The verse is blunt. Director. A father's wrath ignited, but just as quickly as the flame sparks, it vanishes into shadow. What follows is not a decree of judgment, not an order for justice, not even a confrontation between father and son. Instead, what follows is nothing. A silence so loud it pierced the soul of his household. No discipline, no comfort for Tamar, no rebuke for Amnon, no royal verdict for a crime that cried out to heaven. Why? Some scholars suggest that David may have found himself trapped in the web of his own sins. Could it be that the memory of Bathsheba and the blood of Uriah still haunted him? That the guilt of taking another man's wife had dulled his sense of moral authority? Was David paralyzed by shame, feeling unworthy to correct his son for a sin that bore echoes of his own? Or was the conflict deeper still, a war between his identity as king and his heart as a father? Would punishing Amnon mean disrupting the royal line? Would it cause division among the sons and fracture a kingdom already walking on the edge of envy and ambition? Whatever his reasons, the result was the same. A daughter left devastated, a son left unpunished, and another son quietly gathering the storm within his chest. And perhaps this is where the story begins to mirror us. Have you ever stood by knowing something was wrong but felt powerless to act? Have you ever watched injustice unfold in your own home, your own church, your own circle, frozen by fear, shame, or uncertainty? David's silence became a haunting legacy. It rang louder than any cry for help. His inaction wasn't just a failure of justice, it was a betrayal of trust. The very man who had slain Goliath with a stone now trembled before the truth in his own household. And the cost, far more than anyone imagined. The Bible offers no illusions about Tamar's fate. Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house, 2 Samuel 13:20. Once adorned in royal robes, she now wore only grief, her laughter silenced, her future erased, her very identity shattered. The palace where she once danced in celebration was now a prison of memory, and the father who should have risen to defend her became a symbol of abandonment. This moment is where justice died in David's court, not because God was absent, but because David chose silence over righteousness. And the scriptures warn us, when justice is delayed, evil finds courage. Ecclesiastes 8:11 declares, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. David's silence didn't just fail Tamar, it fueled something darker in the hearts of others. One of those hearts belonged to Absalom. He took his sister into his home. He said little, but he noticed everything: the look in Tamar's eyes, the cracks in her voice, the torn robe, the ashes, and most of all, the silence from the throne. 2 Samuel 13:22 tells us, Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. Not a single word, not one outburst, no confrontation, but behind that silence brewed something far different from David's apathy. Absalom's silence was not weakness, it was strategy, the stillness before the storm, the quiet of a heart preparing for vengeance. Have you ever seen someone so wounded by injustice that their silence speaks louder than any scream? While David sat paralyzed by guilt, Absalom's silence was calculated, deliberate, and ice-cold. He would wait, and one day he would make Amnon pay. And so, two silences clashed in the royal palace, the silence of a father who would not act, and the silence of a brother who could not forgive. One allowed evil to flourish, the other prepared to fight it with fire. But what happens when silence becomes judgment? When the sword that never came from the father is taken up by a son? The palace had already witnessed one act of violence, but what was coming next would tear the kingdom apart, and it would all trace back to this moment, when justice whispered but was never heard. For 2 long years Absalom said nothing, not a word to Amnon, not a whisper of his plans, not a hint of the fire smoldering behind his calm expression. But make no mistake, he was not at peace. He was waiting. Every sunrise reminded him of what had been stolen. Every glance at his sister Tamar, living in isolation, clothed in shame, fueled the rage that he refused to release. Have you ever known someone who could smile on the outside while their heart secretly plotted justice? Or maybe vengeance? 2 Samuel 13:23 marks the turning point. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep-shearers were at Baal-Hazor near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. To outsiders, it looked like a celebration, a sheep-shearing festival, a tradition of feasting and laughter, a time when harvests were gathered and wine flowed freely. But for Absalom, it was something else entirely. It was the stage for justice. The justice he believed his father had failed to deliver. Like Amnon before him, Absalom crafted a scheme. But where Amnon's plan had been born of lust and deceit, Absalom's was born of vengeance and cold calculation. He extended invitations to all the king's sons, even to King David himself. In 2 Samuel 13:24, we see him press the invitation. "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" Did he expect David to come? Probably not. But the invitation gave his plan legitimacy, cover, and when David declined, Absalom turned to his true target. "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." 2 Samuel 13:26. The request seemed innocent, even respectful, but beneath its surface was a blade, a sentence already written, a plan already rehearsed. Can you see the tension in this moment? Can you feel how easily death can hide behind formality? If you were David, would you have hesitated? Would you have sensed the trap hidden beneath your son's polite request? David, perhaps still wounded by his failure to act years earlier, relented. Amnon joined the feast, and as wine was poured and laughter rose into the evening sky, Absalom waited for the signal. His servants stood ready, trained and prepared for what they'd been told to do. And then, as recorded in 2 Samuel 13:28, the moment arrived, when Amnon is in high spirits from wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave. What a chilling command, so calm yet final. And just like that, vengeance struck, swift, brutal, unapologetic. Amnon, who once destroyed a sister's life in secret, now met his end in public. Justice, or was it revenge, had found him. But it came not from the throne of the king, nor from the courts of Israel. It came from his own brother's hand. Panic erupted. The other sons of David, fearing for their own lives, mounted their mules and fled into the night. 2 Samuel 13:29. Imagine the chaos, the cries, the clatter of hooves, the blur of royal robes vanishing into the darkness. The feast had turned into a funeral, and the kingdom shuddered with the sound of what had just occurred. But as often happens, the first report that reached David was even more terrifying than the truth. A messenger arrived with breathless urgency. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, not one of them is left. 2 Samuel 13:30. The weight of those words was too much to bear. David, struck by grief and horror, tore his clothes, a gesture of raw mourning and despair, and fell to the ground. 2 Samuel 13:31. Have you ever heard news so devastating, so irreversible, that your body reacts before your mind can catch up? But then, once again, enters Jonadab, the same man whose advice set this entire tragedy in motion. And now, with a strangely composed tone, he steps forward to calm the king. My lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. 2 Samuel 13:32. Only Amnon. The irony is heavy. The same Jonadab who gave voice to Amnon's lust now gives clarity to his death. His words are strangely clinical, as if this outcome were logical, inevitable. Was Jonadab trying to comfort the king or distance himself from the consequences of his own counsel? And David, heartbroken, confused, helpless, stood once again between love and law, pain and consequence. The same hands that once held a sling to strike down Goliath now hung limp at his sides. He had been too passive when it mattered most. And now, the violence he refused to confront had spiraled beyond his control. But make no mistake, the cycle wasn't over. Tamar's shame led to David's silence. David's silence led to Amnon's survival. Amnon's survival led to Absalom's fury, and Absalom's fury would lead to an even greater divide within the house of David. The price of silence wasn't just one son's death, it was the unraveling of the family itself, the beginning of a rebellion that would scar the nation. And so, the question now lingers. What happens when a house built by God begins to collapse from within? When a father's failure to confront sin opens the door to chaos, and when justice is no longer sought through righteousness, but through vengeance, who will pay the price next? After the blood had dried and the shouts of the feast turned to whispers of mourning, Absalom vanished. He fled to Geshur, a region to the northeast, beyond the reach of David's authority and judgment. For 3 years, he remained in exile, far from Jerusalem, far from his father, and far from the palace that had once been his home. But the passage of time did not erase the memory of what had happened, nor did it heal the wounds left behind. In fact, the silence between father and son only deepened the ache. And yet, as the years slipped by, something unexpected began to stir within David's heart. The scriptures tell us in 2 Samuel 13:39, King David longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. Even after the chaos, the loss and the rebellion, David still yearned for Absalom. The ache of a father's love refused to fade. How complex is the human heart that can hold both disappointment and desire? How many parents have wrestled with this very torment, loving a child who has committed the unthinkable? This tender verse reveals something hauntingly beautiful. David, though a king burdened by justice and guilt, was still a father grieving in silence. But that longing, as deep as it was, came too late to undo what had already been set in motion. The entire arc of this tragedy, from Tamar's violation to Amnon's murder to Absalom's exile, teaches us one of the most painful truths of Scripture. Violence breeds violence, and silence in the face of sin multiplies destruction. What might have been contained by righteousness was now rippling outward like cracks in the foundation of a collapsing house. Galatians 6:7 warns us with sobering clarity, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." And David was now reaping a bitter harvest from seeds he had not dared to confront. Tamar's pain had gone unanswered. Amnon's sin had gone unpunished. Absalom's wrath had gone unchecked. And now David, the once mighty king, stood surrounded by absence. A daughter lost to shame, a son buried in dishonor, another son hidden in exile, and a kingdom strained by the fractures of his family. And yet, this was only the beginning of the unraveling. To fully grasp the weight of what followed, we must turn inward and examine the decisions or indecisions that allowed this tragedy to bloom. David, the shepherd boy who faced lions, the warrior who felled giants, the ruler who governed with songs and strength, failed in the one arena where vigilance mattered most, his own home. The first and most crucial mistake, neglecting to stay vigilant. As a seasoned leader, David had the insight to discern friend from foe on the battlefield, but within the palace, he overlooked the shadows creeping through the hearts of his sons. 1 Samuel 16:7 tells us, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." It's a piercing irony. David had been chosen as king precisely because he could see beyond the surface. And yet, when danger crept into his own house, he saw nothing. Have you ever failed to see something simply because it was too close? Sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones seated right at your own table. David's second grave error, paralysis in the face of crisis. After Tamar's violation, the scriptures say David was furious. But fury without action is noise without justice. He was king. He held the authority to investigate, to punish, to protect. Proverbs 21:15 declares, "When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers." Yet there was no justice, no joy, only terror and silence. It's one of the most tragic contrasts in Scripture. The same David who ran toward Goliath with a sling in his hand stood still when his own daughter was crushed. Why is it easier to fight giants on the battlefield than demons in the family? And finally, perhaps the most devastating mistake of all, David allowed his past failures to cripple his present responsibilities. Scholars often point to the guilt he carried from his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. How could a man so compromised confront the sin of another? But avoidance does not cleanse the soul, it only deepens the wound. The words of the prophet Nathan still echoed in his memory. "Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you." 2 Samuel 12:10-11. This wasn't just a prophecy, it was unfolding line by line. So here stood David, once the anointed, once the fearless, now broken by the very thing he failed to master, his own household. But this wasn't the end. Absalom would one day return, and with him not reconciliation but rebellion, because when silence goes unbroken and justice is delayed, wounds do not heal, they fester. So what happens when a father's guilt gives birth to a son's vengeance? When the desire for peace gives way to the thirst for power, and when the kingdom built on divine calling begins to crack under the weight of a father's silence, who, then, can hold it together? Yet the prophecy Nathan gave David, that the sword would never depart from his house, was never meant to be a passive verdict. It was not divine permission to surrender his role as a father. It was a warning, a call to vigilance. A godly man would have taken such a prophecy not as fate carved in stone, but as a sacred responsibility to guard his house with renewed discernment. But David, once so bold in battle, became dangerously hesitant at home. Instead of responding with decisive leadership, he withdrew into silence. And this silence created a ripple effect that would turn his family into a battlefield. The pattern of avoidance didn't stop with Tamar or Amnon or Absalom. It extended into the next generation. In 1 Kings 1:6, when the scriptures introduce yet another of David's sons, Adonijah, we find a chilling description. His father had never rebuked him by asking, "Why do you behave as you do?" This was not a one-time failure. It was a generational flaw. How often does the absence of correction become the root of rebellion? How many leaders have inherited kingdoms, ministries, or homes, only to fall because no one ever asked them the hard questions? David's reluctance to confront sin within his own family left a vacuum where chaos rushed in. In the absence of firm and loving correction, violence and vengeance claimed authority. Ecclesiastes 8:11 makes it painfully clear. When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. David's silence after Amnon's crime didn't bring peace. It invited retaliation. It emboldened Absalom to take justice into his own hands. Can you see it now? The silence that should have brought healing instead served as permission. The delay in justice didn't prevent violence, it ensured it. But perhaps David's most subtle failure, yet equally devastating, was this. He failed to create a home where truth could safely live. There was no refuge of communication, no fatherly embrace where Tamar could cry out for justice. No space where Absalom could process his rage before it turned to murder. The royal palace had walls of stone, but not walls of trust. Tamar's trauma unfolded in silence. Absalom's anger festered in silence, and David's authority dissolved in silence. How different might this story have been if the king had created a culture of honesty instead of one of fear and isolation? Have you ever longed to speak but knew no one would listen, especially the one who should have protected you? Proverbs 29:15 tells us, "A rod and a reprimand impart wisdom, but a child left undisciplined disgraces its mother." Discipline, when rooted in love, creates clarity and structure. But in David's house, permissiveness bred confusion. Entitlement replaced humility. Lust replaced love. And in the absence of correction, the children chose their own paths, paths that led to devastation. David was not just a man, he was a model. And his failure in this area is not just a page in history. It is a warning written in fire for every parent, every pastor, every person called to lead. Authority without accountability is a seedbed for destruction. A father who does not guide his house in truth may one day wake up to find his children warring with each other and with God. The lesson is timeless. When leaders, especially within the family, choose passivity over principle and silence over stewardship, the consequences do not die with the moment. They echo, they ripple, they return, generation after generation. So let us ask ourselves with sincerity and urgency, are there places in our own homes where silence has replaced wisdom? Are there hearts in our care that are crying out for correction, for safety, for truth, but have nowhere to go? David's legacy is not just his psalms or his throne. It's also the pain of what happens when a man of God forgets that spiritual warfare is not only waged on battlefields, but also at the family table. What can we truly take away from the story of David, Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom? A story that is thousands of years old, yet pulses with relevance in every family, every community, and every generation today. This was not just a royal scandal, it was a family breakdown. And the lessons it holds are not confined to palaces or ancient courts. They reach into our homes, schools, churches, and relationships. They challenge us as parents, as leaders, and as human beings responsible for the lives entrusted to us. The first lesson cuts deep. We must be actively vigilant. Scripture doesn't whisper this, it cries it out. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. 1 Peter 5:8. David saw the battlefield clearly, but he failed to discern the war inside his own home. And today, the battleground has shifted. Our children are not only vulnerable in the streets, but in the secret spaces of the internet, the influence of friends, and the loneliness they often carry in silence. This vigilance is not about control. It's not about locking every door and monitoring every step. It's about being present. Are you asking the right questions? Are you noticing the emotional withdrawal, the sudden mood changes, the uncomfortable interactions, the bad influences that speak louder than your own voice? David ignored the warning signs. In today's world, those signs might be a closed bedroom door, a hidden phone screen, an unexpected shift in language or values. Are we paying attention, or are we assuming that it's just a phase? The second lesson is just as critical and urgent. Evil must be confronted immediately and courageously. When Tamar was violated, David was furious, but he did nothing. His silence spoke louder than any judgment he could have given. And in that silence, evil found permission to thrive. James 4:17 leaves no room for excuse. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. In today's terms, this means we must act when something feels wrong. When we sense abuse, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, we do not delay. We do not wait for more proof while someone suffers in silence. We open communication, we set boundaries, we call professionals, we take action. Inaction is not neutrality. Inaction is complicity. The third lesson rises from the very ashes of David's fractured home. We must break the cycle of violence before it spirals. One sin led to another. Lust turned into assault. Silence turned into murder. And the household descended into rebellion. Galatians 6:7-8 reminds us with stark truth, "A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction." In our homes, what seeds are we planting? Are we cultivating healing or harboring grudges? Are we encouraging forgiveness or letting bitterness ferment behind polite smiles? Breaking the cycle requires deliberate intervention, counseling, prayer, real conversations, accountability, and the willingness to uproot generational dysfunction. Are you sowing peace today or postponing a storm for tomorrow? The fourth lesson challenges the core of our identity as parents and mentors. Leadership means presence. Proverbs 22:6 commands, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." But training requires more than good advice. It demands daily involvement. This means showing up when it's inconvenient, sitting down when your child doesn't want to talk, modeling forgiveness, not just preaching it, building trust through consistency. Are your children learning about love, discipline, and faith by watching you, or are they learning by your absence? David was a mighty king, but when his children needed a father, he disappeared into his role instead of stepping into relationship. And finally, the most sobering, the most vital, we must break the silence. The cost of keeping things hidden for the sake of pride, reputation, or fear is far too high. Ephesians 5:11 commands, "Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them." Darkness loses its power when it's brought into the light. But how many families today live behind masks? How many victims are silenced by shame, while perpetrators remain protected by status or fear? What are we willing to risk to protect the vulnerable? Appearances, comfort, position. Breaking the silence means building homes where hard truths can be spoken without judgment. It means having support systems, not just rules. It means saying, "I believe you," before saying, "I need to know more." It means standing in the gap when no one else will. These are not simply suggestions for healthy living. These are urgent, life-saving commands that determine whether a home becomes a sanctuary or a battlefield. Tamar's story was never meant to just shock us. It was meant to warn us, to stir us, to break us if necessary, so that what comes next can be whole. Because the price of silence isn't just pain for one generation, It's destruction that can echo for generations to come. So then the question becomes, how do we move from learning to living, from warning to wisdom? If the story of David, Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom teaches us anything, it's that recognizing the danger is only the first step. Responding with action is what transforms the future. The good news is that it's never too late to build stronger families. No matter your past, your mistakes, or the condition of your household today, God's Word gives us timeless principles that can become everyday practices. Here are powerful, practical steps you can take, starting right now, to guard the hearts within your home and plant seeds of peace that will bear fruit for generations. First, establish consistent moments of family dialogue. Don't wait until a crisis forces you to talk. Create a natural rhythm of communication where openness becomes a habit, not an emergency. Whether during meals, car rides, bedtime routines, or weekend walks, make time for meaningful conversations. Deuteronomy 6:7 gives us this model clearly. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. These everyday moments are where trust is built and hearts are guarded. Ask yourself, do your children know they can talk to you about anything without fear of shame? Have you created a space where truth is welcome, even when it's uncomfortable? Second, develop a proactive family safety plan. Protection isn't just physical, it's emotional, digital, and spiritual. Know your children's friends. Understand their digital world. Set clear, loving boundaries around technology. Create a family code word or emergency signal they can use when they feel unsafe. Keep important contacts visible and regularly updated. Teach your children how to recognize manipulation and pressure, and remind them that no secret should ever be kept if it causes fear or harm. Wisdom is not reactive, it's prepared. Proverbs 22:3 reminds us, "The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it." Don't wait for trouble to knock. Build your refuge now. Third, seek preventive professional support. Just as we schedule regular physical checkups, emotional and relational health also deserves proactive care. A family counselor or Christian therapist can help your household navigate communication breakdowns, unspoken trauma, or patterns that you may not even be aware of. This isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom and humility. You don't need to be in crisis to ask for help. Healing often begins before the wound gets deep. Fourth, nourish family bonds with intentional time together. This includes regular shared meals, weekly family nights, prayer or devotional moments, celebrations of birthdays, answered prayers, and milestones. These aren't just nice traditions, they are soul anchors that remind your children where they belong and who they can count on. Do you know how powerful it is when a child hears their parent pray for them by name? When laughter rings through the house during a board game or a picnic? These moments become emotional armor, protecting their hearts long after the moment passes. Finally, embrace the truth. There is no perfect family, but there can be a faithful one. God never asked you to raise flawless children or to be flawless yourself, but He does call us to be watchful, prepared, and rooted in love. Proverbs 24:3-4 gives us this promise: "By wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures." A wise house is not built in one day, it's built day by day. Through prayers whispered in the night, through apologies humbly spoken, through hard conversations courageously started, through protection fiercely offered, and through grace, always grace, when we fall short. So today, will you make the decision to be the gatekeeper of your home, to watch, to listen, to act, and to love with vigilance? Because the legacy of David's family does not have to be yours. The story of Tamar, Amnon, and David is far more than a tragic chapter in ancient history. It is a mirror held up to our modern lives. It reveals the deep cracks that can form in even the most seemingly blessed homes when silence replaces truth, when inaction replaces justice, and when shame overshadows protection. But we are not bound to repeat their story. Unlike Tamar, you don't have to carry your ashes alone. You are not condemned to weep unheard, unseen, or abandoned in desolation. God sees you, God hears you, and as written in Isaiah 61:3, he promises to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. That restoration is real. That healing is available, not just for individuals, but for entire families willing to rise, speak, and rebuild. Unlike David, you are not disqualified by your past. You may have failed to protect, to notice, or to act, but the grace of God empowers you to begin again. What paralyzed David can become your fuel. What he left undone, you can restore. The same God who forgave David also called him a man after his own heart. Redemption is possible when humility meets obedience. And unlike Amnon or Absalom, you don't have to let pain, lust, or vengeance guide your path. You can break the cycle. You can lead with truth. You can love with courage. This story ends with a choice that now rests with you. Will you follow the footsteps of a king who remained silent while his house unraveled? Or will you rise as a protector, an intercessor, a watchman on the wall of your own family? The price of silence is too high to pay, and the echoes of inaction can last for generations. But so can the blessings of bold, godly intervention. It's time to speak, to act, to stand in the gap, to restore what was broken. Because sometimes the first step to peace is simply breaking the silence. If this message stirred something in your heart, let us know by commenting 777 to declare that you are standing up for truth and protection in your family. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. If you feel led to support this message and help us continue spreading God's truth, you can do so through the Super Thanks option. We are deeply grateful for every gift and even more grateful for your presence here. Whether you donate or not, your time and support are a blessing to us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who may need to hear it today. Your simple act of sharing may be the very thing that helps another family begin their healing journey. May the Lord bless your house with wisdom, protection, and unshakable peace. And may you always remember, in God's hands no silence is too deep to be broken, and no family is too broken to be restored.